Hey everybody, Massachusetts Governor Charlie Baker here. I want to start first of all by thanking Homebase and Resisim for this partnership to bring forth a virtual storytelling on Memorial Day. You know, facts are facts, news is news, but there's nothing like a great story, especially one that's told about men and women who put themselves in harm's way to preserve and protect our democracy and our liberty. Whether you're talking about Flight Girls, which was the story of a group of women pilots in World War II, or you're talking about Flags of Our Fathers, which was written by Jim Bradley to talk about his dad and his time raising the flag in the Battle of Iwo Jima, or Joey Galloway and General Harold Moore, who wrote We Were Soldiers Once and Young about the first major battle of the Vietnam War, or Outlaw Platoon, which is a spectacular book by Sean Parnell about the battle against terrorism in the Middle East. There are stories to be told over and over and over again about the glory and the joy and the tragedy associated with what our men and women in uniform do every single day for the rest of us. And in storytelling, you can bring to life something that is much harder to put forth when you're just talking about facts and numbers and stuff like that. And we have amazing stories to be told by the men and women who wear the uniform and who've worn the uniform on behalf of this great country of ours. And I can't think of a better organization to host an event like this on Memorial Day weekend when we won't be able to do things like plant flags in the U.S. National Cemetery down on the Cape, or participate in some of the events at the Agawam Veterans Cemetery or some of the other places that so many of us find familiar on Memorial Day. But the best part about this is it will give all of us a chance, once again, to hear the stories of those men and women who stood up, signed up, and represented our very best in defending our freedom and our democracy and putting themselves on the field of combat and in harm's way. It is these stories that I hope stay with us all and remind us time and time again that we are lucky that we live among people like this who are willing to do this work and to preserve our rights nobly, with passion, with guts and courage, and ultimately on our behalf. Thank you and God bless.
My story begins in the darkest night of my life. It was in the year of 2014, during Operation Protective Edge. At the time, I was a soldier in an Infantry Special Forces unit. On the last night of the operation, my company was attacked by 2 long-range missiles. Out of 30 soldiers, 12 were injured in the attack, and one of my best friends, Officer Wei Peles, was killed. My job that night was to help prepare my friends for evacuation. I was part of the medics team, and when I got to the house, maybe a minute or two after the explosion, everything was in complete chaos. I remember that if I have to pick out the worst thing that I remember about that night, it would have to be the sounds of my friends screaming in pain and agony. When I got to the house, I wanted to climb up to the second floor to try to find my wounded friends. When I was walking up the staircase, I was just overwhelmed by everything that I saw, the smoke, the chaos, the smells, the sounds, and so I froze. It was only for 10 seconds, but I froze, and little did I know that these 10 seconds would remain with me as my greatest and deepest shame for many years to come. When the operation was over, we still had 6 more months of service. In my company, the night that Roy has died, the operation, everything became a complete taboo. We never spoke about it. We never spoke about how it affected us or anything. And then after 6 months, we were released from the army. When I was already a civilian, I remember that I started experiencing very strange things. I remember that I experienced my very first anxiety attack. I had no idea what it was or what it was connected to. There was just a moment where I could not breathe anymore. And so I remember that I ran to my room, and for like 15 minutes, I sat in the dark. And I remember I was very upset with myself that I was going to die because I can't breathe, without knowing why or what it was connected to. After the army, I knew that something was wrong. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know what anxiety was or anything. But I knew that something was wrong, and so I decided to seek out help. I wanted to go to this reserves unit to get a psychology treatment, and so I did. It was the only thing that was available for me, and it was free, and it was also limited. The treatment was only for 2 months, but there something very important happened. Is they told me about the term PTSD, and not only that they told me about it, they also told me that I have it. After the treatment was over, very quickly I knew that something was missing. The treatment was not enough. And so I kept experiencing these strange things. I kept experiencing nightmares. I had a lot of trouble sleeping. I was experiencing paranoia. For me, leaving the house was such a task because every time I left the house, I thought that people were trying to kill me, wanted to kill me, that I have to protect myself against them. I was fired from 2 jobs because working with anxiety is very difficult. I broke up with my girlfriend because I was very ashamed of my situation. I felt that I was completely insane, and I felt that she didn't deserve someone like me who was insane and not sane. I was very lonely. I never spoke to my family or to my friends about my condition, and I tried to repress it. And so I fell to the bottle. I started drinking a lot, and I would find myself maybe 3 or 4 times a month in an alleyway, completely helpless after drinking too much. Because of all of these things, in the end, I also became very suicidal. I remember that I was living a life that was not worth living, and the only reason I did not take my own life was the thought of my mother, that I could not do it to her. A year and a half after I finished the army, a friend came to me and offered to me to go with him to South America. At the time, I never thought about doing things for fun. I was all about survival, but I had some money, and I said, like, what the heck? Maybe I'll go with him, and we'll see what happens. And so I found myself in this strange new continent. When I got to South America, things started to change gradually. I had some room for reflection, to think about everything that I have gone through in the army, in therapy. I had a safe distance from Gaza, from all of the anxiety that we have here in Israel. But most importantly, I gained from that continent a whole bunch of new strangers. Meeting all these new people, it was much easier for me to share my story, to talk for the very first time about PTSD, about my shame, about my symptoms, about what I have passed. And the more I spoke about it, the more I realized that maybe I was not as crazy as I thought I was, but maybe I was experiencing a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. I could not get enough, and so I decided to buy a bicycle. I bought my bike in Chile, and I crossed the whole continent from Chile to Colombia in 1 year. During that trip, I experienced amazing things. I slept in strangers' houses. I crossed mountain ridges. I slept in the streets. I even got hit by a car at one point. But the most meaningful experience that I had was actually buying a computer. The more I shared my story, the more I realized its value. And so I decided to also write my story. When I started using words to describe my trauma and my experiences, and writing about my shame, I understood that it has great power, and it could neutralize the effects of the PTSD, of my shame. Shame is just like a secret. The minute you bring it to light, it loses its meaning. It loses itself. I kept on writing, and after a year, I came back to Israel a new man. Those writings would later become a book that I'm holding right now. I was there, a book that would eventually changed my life. But when I came back to Israel, I also came back a new man, a man that was able to communicate his experiences. I started talking to my family about PTSD and to my friends, and I stopped being so ashamed of my situation. After a few years, I regained my family, I regained my friends, and at some point, I even regained my girlfriend. Uh, I felt that I finally found the missing piece. Not only therapy, but also community. And through community, I regained a life worth living. Thank you.
I was in the United States Army for 8 years, and I did 2 tours to Afghanistan. I was a medic, and from moment to moment, that meant a lot of different things. Um, Most of the time, you were just another soldier doing your job. Other times, you took on more of like a social worker sort of role. You were somebody to listen. And at other times, you were an advisor. Many of the times, on the really bad days especially, you were hope. Hope that the wrongs could be made right, that everything was going to be okay, you were going to be okay, and it wasn't that bad, even if it was that bad. And on a handful of occasions, I've been called the most beautiful angel anyone had ever seen. But in all fairness, most of those guys hadn't seen a woman in a very long time, and morphine is a hell of a drug, so you don't want to judge them too much. As a female and as a medic, I had a lot of opportunities. Opportunities to be with a bunch of different groups and to fill in and to take on, unique missions. And I did so. I didn't realize that it would come at a cost later in life. But I traveled a lot, and a lot of the times when I was the only female, I lived alone. And if I didn't live alone, I slept in shifts. So you didn't have much interaction even with your peers. If I wasn't working, I was reading. I had my nose in a book. You can always learn more. And if I wasn't reading, I was training. You could always get better. That was the mentality. The trouble is, as time goes on, there's not a lot of bond that you create with the men and women around you. You're always on call. There's always someone who needs you. All the information you're privileged to is private, and it's private for a good reason. And there's just no time. You don't have a lot of time to digest all of the bad things that can happen in a day. So it leads to a lot of isolation, and that isolation adds up over time. I do remember this one occasion when I was out with the infantry. I was on a small combat outpost, and I didn't know these guys before I deployed, so I never had the opportunity to train with them. The best way you get to know each other in the military is very often training. You get to see what the other person knows and see how they react, and it's really it's the only effective way we have to get to know each other quickly. So we would do these mock drills. We would do these fake situations where we would have fake casualties and fake injuries, and we would see how we would react, how we would treat them, and our movements, and that's how we would test what we needed to improve. That's how we would test each other. And after every one of these drills, we would sit together and talk about what went wrong, what went well, what we can improve upon, and we would reset the equipment and do it all over again, get ready for the next drill. There was one occasion where we were all sitting together and talking out the last situation, and from the top of the hill, you could see this four-wheeler just like speeding down the road with this special forces soldier on him. And you could tell he was special forces because everything he has is much cooler than ours. And he's just screaming and hollering for us to get out of the way. And where was our PA and our doctor? And, I kind of thought his acting was over the top, but I was really, really impressed that we had so many people involved in these drills, in these situations. You don't often get that. So I was really impressed that so many people were participating. So we jump onto the truck and we go racing up to their compound. And we jump off the truck, we run towards the first body that we can see laying on the ground, and we're very verbal, so, we call out what we see. And we approach the body, and he was dead. This particular person was he was dead. And we knew something had gone really wrong here. So training kicks in and he's dead, and so you moved on to the next person, and it was their commander. I knelt beside him and I started to work on him. He was shot through the belly. He wasn't bleeding much, but he wasn't breathing either, so I knew I had to start breathing for him. And I had to put a tube in his throat, but before I could, I had to reach into his mouth, and I pulled out some chewing tobacco, and it smelled like wintergreen. And I still remember that smell. And put a tube in his throat. I started breathing for him, and I started listening to the other man in the room who was shot in the leg, but he was verbal. And he started explaining what had happened. The interpreter, the Afghan interpreter, had turned against the Special Forces soldiers, and he took a weapon that was mounted on the wall, and it was loaded, and he started opening fire. He started shooting everyone he could. He had killed their youngest outside. He was barely any facial hair, and he had baby blue eyes and dirty blonde hair, and he had shot their commander. And the chief was the one who took him down, shot him in the head before he could do more damage. And we worked on them. We worked on all of them, and we got the commander to the next level of care. We got him on the helicopter and tried to get him some help. We went back to our aid station, and we did what we always did, which was talk about what happened, what we could do better. We reset our equipment, and we moved on. That would be the extent of most of my interactions, these really intense, intimate moments without this personal touch. I would never remember anyone's name. I wouldn't get details as to who they were. I would never see most of them again, or any of them. And, that catches up after a while. When I got out, I thought this burden would be lifted off my shoulders and that I would feel better. I got a job, I started going to college, and I lived alone in Boston. I moved here by myself. And I wasn't happy. I just was angry all the time. I was frustrated. I felt really isolated. And I went and sought out mental health because I didn't know what I could do. I didn't know what was wrong. And that was the extent of my language. I'm not happy. Something's wrong. Help me. And we did some digging, and of course, post-traumatic stress comes up. And then as time went on, the only way I can describe it is that I sort of realized that I had this mental storage unit in my head with a bunch of unmarked boxes. And these boxes represented all the experiences that I had had that I just didn't have time to deal with when it was happening, and I had put away to deal with later. And I realized I was having to go through one of these boxes each at a time, and to open one box was to acknowledge 1,000 others, and I was overwhelmed. It was filled with things that I wanted to block out for a good reason, and now I had to go through them and decide what was useful and what wasn't. And if any of you have ever moved before, that can get time-consuming and overwhelming, and I couldn't do it without any help. I had to establish a network of people who could help me go through these boxes and understand these experiences and what they meant. And I hope that my story can help shed some light on why medical professionals find it so hard to find some peace in life. And it's because you didn't have time to really deal with this stuff before. And now you have to go through these empty, unmarked boxes one by one, and you'd be surprised all the things that you forgot and the things that come up. But with some help, you can decide what you can keep and what you can share and what you need to get rid of. Thank you.
My first out of many combat deployment to Lebanon was the worst one. Near the end of it, 2 days before my 20th birthday, I was involved in an incident that almost led to my death. It was dusk, near sunset. The scenery was quite pastoral. The green valley below, the green hills on the mountain. We climbed with an armed personal vehicle from the regiment headquarters to our front post up in the mountain. When we entered the gate of the post, I took a look at the hill above the post and I saw 4 or 5 great balls of fire coming out of the hill directly to me. Immediately I realized it was RPG rockets. Then I realized that I have no chance and it will probably the end of my life. I froze for maybe 2 to 3 seconds. This freezing gave me many years of survival guilt and shame. I keep asking myself why I froze. Maybe I should respond faster. It tortured me for many years. I came to my senses as the second wave of RPG rockets came out of the hill. Now I climbed. I pull out my fellow friend driver from his driver's seat. We jump out of the vehicle and hide behind it. We immediately realize it's a death trap, so we start to run. Try to find a safe place. We run in an open area and then a machine gun open fire at us. Bullets whistle around us, between my legs, above my head. After maybe 1 minute of running, we came to a safer place. And after 1 or 2 minutes, the incident was over. This was a grandiose ending for what have been a turbulent 3 months of constant attack on our post. We probably the most attacked post firebase in all Lebanon. For 3 months, we had daily attacks, sometimes few times a day. Eight years after the incident, I got diagnosed with PTSD. It was after a year of both in the compulsory service and in reserve army service, packed with many incidents in the battlefields of Lebanon and Gaza Strip. I started my PTSD journey, a very long journey. I totally collapsed, and then I was, for many years, suffering from an anxiety attack, flashbacks, nightmares, etc. For almost 25 years since the incident, I felt like I'm an alien. I don't feel that I belong to my country, my home, my community, my family, my friends. I don't trust nobody. I didn't care of being a social function at all. The only place that I felt I miss is the battlefield. Over there, I feel at home. I feel that I'm belonging to my friends. I have the ability to get along even in combat, but at home I lost that feeling. 11 years ago, I decided that I need some big experience that not involve my PTSD. I was a really fat man, haven't done any kind of sport activity for more than 15 years. And on this background, I decided to run a marathon. I thought to myself, okay, this is a normal midlife crisis. It doesn't belong to my PTSD. So I decided to run a marathon and I start my training. Along the way, in advanced stage of the training near to the marathon itself, my PTSD joined the journey. I started to have symptoms of an anxiety attack, flashbacks, etc. during running. It was horrible, and I really talked about, okay, I can't do it. I might quit, but I decided to continue because I'm a man with a mission. I run a marathon. After 1 year of training, I crossed the finish line of my first marathon. It was a great personal achievement. but it was much more than that. When I crossing the finish line, I actually found my life destiny. My life changed forever. It took me 2 years after this first marathon out of 7 that I already ran. I joined in partnership with Natal, the leading Israeli NGO in the field of trauma, and we started and found a running project for PTSD patients, especially veterans of war. We develop a special and unique project that based on a self-development model. The pillars of the model are running, I can call it the healing power of running, the feeling of belong to a group similar to this warrior brotherhood, back to life and back to community. And in the end, I want to say thank you for listening and keep on running. Thank you.
The motto of the U.S. Army Special Forces is De Oppresso Liber. Translated from Latin, it means to free the oppressed. Ever since I was a young boy growing up on military installations, I wanted to be a Green Beret. And after nearly 2 years of training in 2004, I became one. Over the course of my career thus far, I've lost several exceptional warriors under my command, and many wounded. And those have been, quite frankly, the most difficult moments of my career. And those moments have lingered with me. But it's harder for me to make sense of the suffering and death of those who cannot defend themselves, the children. So prior to my first deployment, our Special Forces detachment trained for several months prior to going to Afghanistan. We trained like hell to be an effective and a formidable force. We were confident and motivated and eager to take the fight to the enemy. We trained like most special operation units on immediate action drills. We fired multiple weapon systems, received advanced medical training. We were extremely fit, and we were selected for this particular mission in this location because we were a specially trained mountain team. I wanted to show my mettle as a man, as a soldier, as a combat leader, and I wanted to take the fight to the enemy. But nothing we did over those several months of arduous training would prepare me for what I would later see and experience. All of our extensive training would not prepare me for the emotional toll. I would learn later why great military theorists would use words like complex and violent and fog to describe warfare. We weren't there solely to fight our country's adversaries, as I would later learn. There was much more to it. It was 2006, and it was my first deployment as a Green Beret. And I was the commander, and like every commander, you're responsible for what the team does or does not do. After a long helicopter flight through some of the most rugged and desolate terrain I've ever seen, I finally got to my remote fire base in Afghanistan. The base was surrounded by mountains in 10,000 feet in elevation. It was snowy, and I remember it being very cold. The base was very, very austere. There was no running water. Electricity was intermittent because of the unreliable generators, and food was also limited because it was very difficult to resupply the base, not only because of the enemy threat, but because the passes would often fog up, inhibiting aircraft from flying through. So we landed, and I remember immediately our team went to work transitioning with the outgoing team. We unloaded our gear, we prepared and identified locations for all of our key weapon systems. We discussed our actions if the base was attacked, and I remember receiving an updated intelligence brief. Shortly thereafter, while we were in the middle of our transition, it was interrupted when a father brought in a young child wrapped in a brown wool blanket from the neighboring village to seek medical assistance. We had the only medical clinic in the region. It was manned by 2 Green Beret medics, and we had 2 small treatment beds. And we found out through our interpreter that to stop the infant from crying, his father poured boiling chai over the baby's genitals. And I remember looking at the kid. He was 5 months, maybe 6 months old. I really didn't know. And the sight was horrific. And it was evident to me that the baby had been crying for a very long time and really didn't have much left to give, except for an occasional muffled cry. And with our limited medical supplies, my medic Pete treated the baby, and I was infuriated and I was sickened, and I felt for this little boy because he had no future. His life would be riddled with pain and suffering and loss, and I just couldn't imagine why a father would do this to his child. Later that day, I was introduced to a young boy. He worked on our small fire base, and he was about 10 years old, and he wore Western-style clothing that soldiers' families from back home sent to him. He did a lot of errands on the camp. He washed dishes, he did other chores, he made some chai, and then one of the guys from the previous team gave him a Boston Red Sox hat that he wore every single day when he entered our fire base to work. The outgoing commander had told me that his parents were recently killed by the Taliban. We affectionately called him Short Round, the same name of the orphan in Indiana Jones. Over the course of several months, I developed a strong affinity for Short Round. I saw him daily. He always worked so hard. He was so appreciative, and he always seemed to be searching for some semblance of belonging, of kinship, because he had no family, and we were his family. Yet he always had a smile on his face, and so cheerful. Although at the time, my wife and I had no children, during our occasional calls over satellite phone, we discussed adopting Short Round. I wanted to give him a better life, to care for him, to just give him a chance, some opportunity. Several weeks, it was actually a few months after being at our fire base, it was early springtime, we returned from a multi-day foot patrol. And as we were coming back to our fire base, one of the local villagers told us that Short Round was killed. And this was devastating for me to contend with. It was very crushing. And it impacted me on a number of levels. An innocent child killed because he worked with us. I now have 2 incredible young boys, and my wife never knew why I would get so irritable and anxious at the moment they would cry. Now that they're a little bit older, I reinforce to my boys to not only to protect themselves, but to also defend those that can't protect themselves. And I want the very best for my boys. I want them to be appreciative, to love life, to be gentlemen, to be grateful and humble and happy. And I haven't yet told them the story about Short Round, but when they get older, I certainly will. So for me, I continue to serve because of the selfless teammates I've served with over the course of my career. I continue to serve because I love what I do. I continue to serve because I love our country and our way of life. I continue to serve because I believe in freeing those that are oppressed. And I continue to serve because of children like Short Round. So last summer, I just completed my 10th combat deployment to Afghanistan. And between there and Iraq, I've got about 54 months of deployment time. And one thing I've realized over the course of my career is that war isn't just about the violent clash of two opposing wills. There's a human component, and it touches many, and often it's the people that can't protect themselves. So I think about the children whose scared faces I saw in my night vision goggles while doing raids, the faces of children who saw their fathers killed from an airstrike, the children who showed little emotion to receiving toys that are from care packages that our families sent, the children who stood expressionless on the side of the road as I peered through my dusty sunglasses while riding by in our gun trucks, the children who continue to suffer with little education, healthcare, or opportunity. And now my two incredible young boys they're about the same age as Short Round. Last summer, we moved to Boston, and we went to a game at Fenway Park, and later my wife bought them Red Sox baseball hats. Now I remind my boys how special we are, how privileged we are to be Americans. We must always remember our fallen and the sacrifice of their families. And on Memorial Day and every day, not only should we remember the Americans we've lost, but we must also think about the children who continue to live under oppression and the ones like Short Round who have also fallen. Thank you for listening today.
Hello, I'm Boston Man Marty Walsh, and I want to thank Homebase and Resisim for putting on this virtual event. It's important that we continually find new ways to support veterans and their families, and honor those who made the ultimate sacrifice. Here in Boston, Homebase has been an outstanding leader, putting veterans' needs and veterans' voices on the forefront. We've made big strides in improving resources for our veterans, especially those dealing with the invisible wounds of war. Mental health and community support are always vitally important, but especially now as lots of people around the globe are dealing with the lack of connection. It's great that you're able to put together a virtual event so our military families can connect with each other, people who understand what they're going through. I want to remind everyone that if you're feeling isolated, please know that you're not alone. There are services out there, there are people out there. Please pick up the phone and call. This Memorial Day, reach out to your loved ones or anyone who you think might be struggling. Personal connections can make a world of difference. Thank you for all you do, and have a great Memorial Day.